smoky, tender, juicy brisket burnt ends, sauteed onions, garlic and jalapeno, pinto beans, spices, all coming together to make one great big pot of authentic Texas cowboy brisket pinto beans. I've been wanting to do this particular beans recipe video for a while, and now I'm finally getting around to it. Now, if you've never had the Texas or cowboy style beans like this, they're quite a bit different than the more northern style beans like a pork and beans or a baked beans, which tend to be on the sweet side or even pretty significantly sweet. These cowboy or Texas style beans are much more on the savory end. In fact, there's not really anything sweet about them. Made with pinto beans, mixed with lots of onion, optionally jalapeno, all the right seasonings, and of course some delicious brisket burnt ends chopped up and thrown in there. A little brothy compared to the northern baked beans. This is definitely one of my favorite things to serve as a side with really any kind of barbecue meat. So let's get right into it and start making this thing. So the very first thing we need to do to make our Texas brisket beans is to, well, smoke a brisket. That's right. This is also a brisket smoking video. How else do you think we're gonna get the brisket burnt ends for this recipe? And while I'm not a brisket expert, and there are certainly more thorough brisket smoking videos out there by some seriously skilled pit masters, we'll still go through every step to make a wonderfully tender, juicy, smoky, barky barbecue brisket. The first thing I need to do is trim this thing up. Again, I'm not an expert in trimming a brisket, but the basics are pretty straightforward. On the bottom side, I want to remove any obvious pieces of surface fat. This thick, hard fat is not going to render down in any way that creates an enjoyable eating experience, so we're trimming it off. The same goes for any silver skin we might see. Next, we're flipping it over and doing some trimming to the top side. There is a pretty thick fat cap on this side, and we don't need all of it. Yes, we want a nice fat cap to render down and make the brisket juicy and amazing, but anything more than about a 1/4 inch thick just won't be that enjoyable. Lastly, we need to do some basic shaping. This big ass, full, untrimmed brisket needs to be evened out, tightened up, and made just a little more smoker friendly. So I'm going to cut off a sizable portion of the thinner part of the lean section and trim up the sides a bit all the way around, and then just round off all the corners a little so those edges don't get overcooked and crispy during our long cook. When this thing is looking about as good as my skill level will accommodate, it's time to season. Since our goal is Texas style brisket beans, we're going with a Texas style rub. Nothing but kosher salt and coarse black pepper. I'm going with a standard 50-50 salt to pepper ratio, which is going to provide just the right amount of saltiness and create a beautiful dark bark on this brisket. So I'll thoroughly coat all sides and edges of this big ol' thing, taking care not to leave any bald spots. This is a massive slab of meat, and I am not at all worried about over seasoning with this 50-50 rub. And no, I'm not using a binder of any sort. The meat itself is plenty wet and tacky to hold all of this rub in place. Now this thing is finally ready to cook, so I'll get some lump charcoal fired up, and then into the Oklahoma Joe offset it goes, along with a chunk of oak wood. Once the smoker is up to temperature, in goes the brisket. And of course I'll stick one of my thermometer probes in there, so I always know exactly where the internal temp is at all times. And now to let this thing smoke for many, many hours. I'll maintain a temperature in the smoker between 225 and 250 degrees and just let it do its thing. After a little more than 5 hours, the brisket's internal temperature has reached 165. And at this time, I'll go ahead and pull that brisket out and give it the old aluminum foil half wrap. This is going to help get that brisket through the quote stall and carry us through to the end of this cook. I prefer this method to the full foil wrap or the paper wrap, but any method is going to work out pretty well. About another 5 hours later, and this brisket has reached an internal temp of 203 degrees. It's probing ridiculously tender, and this thing is officially done cooking, which of course means that it's now time to rest for, well, several more hours. I'll get this thing laid out on a couple new layers of aluminum foil and drizzle over a bunch of the cooking juices before tightly wrapping up the whole brisket so it can rest for the next few hours, pretty much until the internal temp has come back down to about 170 degrees. And now here we are at what seems like an eon since I first started cooking, and it's finally time to slice this brisket. And if that isn't an absolute sight for sore eyes, I don't know what is. The juice, the bark, the smoke ring. I implore you to find a single thing about this brisket that doesn't make it absolutely mouthwatering. But it's no time to get sidetracked. We have an objective here, and that objective is burnt ends pinto beans. So I'll go ahead and slice off the burnt end, and maybe a little extra just to be sure that we have plenty to work with. And as much as I want to just start snacking on these things, I will refrain, because these burnt ends still have a very important role to play. As for the rest of the brisket, I'm sure it's delicious, but my beans recipe only really calls for the burnt ends, so we don't really need any of this. Just kidding. I know there's at least one guy in Texas watching this who just spit their coffee all over their computer screen. Sorry about that. I couldn't help myself. I assure you, I've got big plans for the rest of this brisket. But for now, just a quick taste. We've got beans to make. First, just a little prep work. I'll start by giving those burnt ends a rough chop so they'll be ready a little later when we need them. Next, 2 pounds of dried pinto beans. I'll give all these beans a thorough rinse with some cold water and give them a quick look through to make sure there's no bits of stone or debris or anything like that. Then I'm going to chop up 2 medium-sized yellow onions, nothing fancy, just a pretty standard dice on these. Followed by a couple jalapenos. I'll remove the seeds and pith, cut them long ways, and then pretty finely chop them up. These ended up being particularly hot jalapenos, and in hindsight, I wished I'd only used one, but oh well. Lastly, a bunch of cloves of garlic, minced or crushed. I used pretty much a whole bulb here because why not? I will mention that I'm making a double batch of these beans today in case it seemed like I'm using an awful lot of these ingredients. Now we're moving outside and I'm firing up my Camp Chef stove. It's a beautiful day out and this seems like the perfect dish to cook outdoors. I'll get some olive oil heated up in my big Enamel Dutch oven over about medium-high heat. When the oil is good and hot, in go the onions and jalapeno. And I'll just saute them for a couple minutes until the onions are starting to look translucent. Then in goes the garlic, and I'll cook another minute. Next, I'm adding in all the dried pinto beans, and to that I'll pour in 1 quart of beef broth, followed by just enough water to submerge everything in the pot by 1 to 2 inches. Give it a quick stir, and let it all come up to a simmer. And now I'll cover the pot, reduce the heat to quite low, and I'm just going to let everything simmer away for about 2 hours, stirring occasionally. Though at about the 1 hour mark, I will check the water level. A lot of that liquid has absorbed into the beans and we need to add a little more. So I'll heat some water up in my kettle and pour it in until I'm back at about 2 inches over the level of the beans. And be sure to add hot water, not cold, as to not completely cool everything down and basically stop the cooking process. Okay, another hour has passed, and now it's time to add the rest of our ingredients, starting with the dry seasonings: kosher salt, black pepper, onion powder, garlic powder, ground cumin, and ancho chili powder. Give it all a quick stir, and then in goes about 2 cups of those chopped burnt ends. Give it all one more stir, and now I'm just letting it simmer on low, uncovered, for about another hour. And here we are after another hour, and these beans are done cooking. So I'll bring this pot back inside and let it sit for just a little while. As it all cools down to an enjoyable eating temperature, a little more of the liquid will have evaporated off, leaving us with what I consider to be the perfect consistency. Slightly brothy, meaty, seasoned perfectly. That's a seriously hearty bowl of old-fashioned Texas goodness right there. Oh, and I can't forget the garnish. You guessed it, some more brisket. Just for, a little pop of color. Absolutely delicious. I would not change a thing about this, with the possible exception of the amount of jalapenos I added. I am notoriously kind of wimpy when it comes to spicy foods, and I think that was on almost the upper level of spiciness that I can handle. But those were some pretty big jalapenos, and they were kind of especially hot. But that's not going to stop me from eating it, nor has it ever. If you like really spicy, add some more jalapeno or some serrano or whatever kind of hot peppers you like. For me, I don't think I'll ever go more than 2 jalapenos for this great big double batch that I made. And regarding the brisket, yes, I had to smoke an entire brisket to make this pot of beans. But of course, the side effect to that is now I have an entire brisket to enjoy and share. Not to mention all the meat trimmings that are gonna get turned into sausage or burgers, all the fat that I have since turned into beef tallow. But if you don't want to go through the whole thing of making a brisket just to get those burnt ends out of it, your store may sell just little hunks of burnt end from brisket that you can buy just for this. And if not, you can substitute it with something else, like some smoky bacon. Won't be quite the same, they won't be brisket beans, but still be pretty good. Anyway, as always, I'll have the full recipe and a link in the video description below. If you want to check it out, try making this for yourself. I'll also list a few of the gadgets and tools and things that I used in the making of this video. And be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future barbecue and smoking videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Great Lakes Country. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.